discussion between Mark Wilson and myself. So my title is, it's about Wandering Significant, Mark Wilson's large book, published in 2006, and my small book, Dynamics of Reason, published in 2001.
He sent me a draft of a book that beats my book all to hell.
That's a draft, that's a draft. Okay, so as you know, Mark and I have much in common. We both address problems of interest to contemporary philosophy of science and to contemporary, oh, by the way, there's a handout, I think everyone has it, it's 2 pages. One has quotations on it, one side, on one side and the reverse side, and the other one is a picture, 2 pictures actually. One is Mark's picture on top and my picture below it. So mostly I'm not going to save time, I'm not going to read the quotations, so I have them here for you. Okay, we both address problems of interest to contemporary philosophy of science and to contemporary philosophy more generally, at least we hope, by presenting detailed accounts of particular episodes from the history of the mathematical sciences. Moreover, we both concentrate on events at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, where episodes in the development of the mathematical sciences were intimately entangled with key developments in late 19th century scientific philosophy, involving such figures as Helmholtz, Mach, Maxwell, Poincaré, Hertz, and Duhem, among others. These developments had a defining impact in turn on the development of early 20th century scientific philosophy and philosophy of science in the work of Russell, Schlick, Carnap, and many others. Wilson and I emphatically agree that both contemporary philosophy of science and contemporary philosophy more generally have much to learn from revisiting these earlier episodes. But there are important differences between our 2 projects when it comes to evaluating the broader metaphysical and epistemological significance of the scientific developments on which we focus. I place my historical narrative within an explicitly Kantian philosophical tradition, operating with a conception of scientific objectivity and rationality, emphasizing intersubjective agreement among rational human knowers, rather than a notion of correspondence between our scientific representations and a mind-independent external world. Now I just referred to quotation number 1. I'm not really even going to give you time to read it right now, where I basically make this kind of Kantian contrast and say that's what I'm doing. Wilson, by contrast, explicitly distances himself from such a Kantian or neo-Kantian perspective in endorsing, as opposed to rejecting, scientific realism. That's quotation number 2, where he talks about regulative principles, and refers to neo-Kantianism and refers to me, and says at the end, well, he would rather go with a realist point of view. Earlier, Wilson considers such contemporary philosophers as Gary Ebbs and Crispin Wright, a few pages before this, who supply us with Erzat's notions of objectivity derived from Kant. So here's one quote that's not on your handout. Wilson says on page 80, "These surrogate proposals follow Kant in claiming that a defensible notion of conceptual objectivity should turn upon our abilities to reach a classificatory or truth-evaluative accord with our fellow men. Proper objectivity in classification represents a matter of interpersonal agreements rather than correspondence to unsullied data," end quote. As Wilson also rightly emphasizes, this rejection of correspondence on behalf of intersubjectivity is characteristic of early 20th century neo-Kantian scientific philosophy, especially as developed by Ernst Cassirer, a philosopher whom Wilson respects while also firmly rejecting Cassirer's fundamental approach to scientific objectivity. Here's quotation 3, which I will read because it's beautiful Wilsonian language at the end. "Cassirer's approach," he says, "presumes a rejection of straightforward realism with respect to either the physical world or mathematics, following the usual neo-Kantian inclination to treat scientific objectivity as the sharing of investigative standards between different public parties, rather than direct correspondence with empirical reality. Allied themes remain popular in philosophical circles today, although I will have no truck with them myself." Like the no truck. Those of you who are not native English speakers may remember. Okay, Wilson's friendly distancing himself from the project of my dynamics of reason above, in quotation number 2, goes hand in hand with his respectful yet firm rejection of Cassir's neo-Kantian approach, or at least this notion of objectivity, which approach is viewed much more sympathetically within my own project, of course. A related sharp difference between our two projects concerns the central place I give to Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions, which I take very seriously indeed as constituting the main threat to scientific rationality and objectivity I want to overcome. In particular, whereas I want to acknowledge the importance of Kuhn's notion of conceptual incommensurability, for Wilson, this notion represents the final degeneration of the approach to scientific concepts represented by Hilbert's conception of implicit definition within an axiomatic theory, according to which global axiomatic structuring within such a theory is all that scientific objectivity requires, and indeed all that the meaning of the concepts requires. For Wilson, this idea leads ultimately to Quine's Haley holism, that's his phrase, not Quine's, but Wilson's, and Kuhn's picture of an unresolvable clash between conceptually incommensurable scientific paradigms is its logical outcome. This is quotation number 4, which I will read. My discussion, Wilson says, will display a mesoscopic emphasis, this came up in discussion, that falls between the attention to individual word meaning, typical of the classical tradition, the doorknob, is that the example? Doorknob example, that falls between the attention to individual word meaning, typical of the classical tradition, and the sprawling webs of belief favored by Quine in his cohorts. In Wilson's diagnosis, it is the intimations of intentionality arising in the middle range that most commonly occasion the familiar puzzlements of philosophy, as well as inducing the scientific impasses that Kuhn mistakenly characterizes as the clash of paradigm-addled mindsets, end quote. Wilson later concretely illustrates what he has in mind in considering the turn-of-the-century clash between 19th and 20th centuries between Duhem and Kelvin concerning the role of classical mechanical molecular theory in accounting for the observable behavior of macroscopic matter. That's quotation number 5, which I'll also read. As modern academic philosophers and historians, we can properly fault ourselves for having, and by historians he clearly means Kuhn and his followers, for having not profited better from classical physics travails by continuing to see such disputes between Duhem and Kelvin as battles of paradigms and webs of belief, rather than puzzle reactions that arise when unsuspecting practitioners confront the delicate filigree of patchwork arrangements typical of successful classes of reduced variables, end quote. I will return below to exactly what Wilson means by such a delicate filigree of patchwork arrangements, and why he takes this idea both to support scientific realism and to be incompatible with Hilbert's overriding emphasis on implicit definitions. But I first want to say something about the origin and motivations of my own version of neo-Kantianism, as well as its connection with what I take to be the importance of Kuhnian scientific revolutions. I will then turn to a parallel consideration of the origin and motivations of Wilson's project. I hope to show that the differences between our two projects concerning realism, neo-Kantianism, implicit definitions, and Kuhnian paradigms are not as irreconcilable as first appears, and in the end, that our two projects are complementary rather than incompatible, focusing on different aspects of the historical development of modern physics from Newton to the early 20th century, which two sets of developments are equally important, I think, from a philosophical point of view. So here, when I address this apparent metaphysical issue between Wilson and myself about realism versus a kind of Kantian anti-realism, I'm going to follow a Carnapian strategy of trying to dissolve this dispute by saying, really, there isn't a substantive disagreement. We're just focusing on different aspects of the important developments in late 19th and early 20th century physics that contributed to this great revolutionary change. And there's room for both of them.